In this section, we're going to be jumping into Dynamesh. I'm going to duplicate, and we're going to turn this into a Dynamesh. So we look at the frame, we've got decent geometry, everything's looking pretty solid, but now I just want to sculpt without worrying about my topology. I've used these low subdivisions to get my forms where they are and to get the character, I would say, 60% there. There are a lot of things that are a little tricky to organize in Dynamesh, and I wanted to make sure that the character was resolved enough before jumping into it. We're going to lose our subdivisions, but we'll always have this version right here. If we ever don't like what we're doing in Dynamesh, we can always project the old version back onto the new. So let's go to this current version, and what we're going to do is we're going to find a density that we're comfortable with Dynamesh. So let's look at what Dynamesh is going to do. So right now we have our geometry. It's fairly well organized. I'm going to try this a couple of times. Make sure project is on so that we can see the detail. And I'm going to hit Dynamesh. Alright. Make sure Dynamesh is on. Okay, it's very even. Now you can see we've lost quite a bit of detail. Not a problem. Instead of dividing our model to get more resolution, we can just increase our resolution here. And I'm going to soften an area and just hit Control and slide to the side here. And we're going to see what Dynamesh does. Alright, we have 700,000 polygons. Here it was 5, so we should be able to get all of this detail back. And I'm just going to hit project. You want to make sure that these are the only two visible models. And you'll also notice that Dynamesh held on to our polygroups. That's a great new feature. Let's hit project, and it takes a little bit of time. And there's all of our detail. Excellent. Okay. You can see there's not too much of a difference between the two. Dynamesh has a little bit more of an edge. It's not quite as clean, obviously, as the Zbrush version, but that's not a problem. We can always increase the resolution when we need it just by upping the resolution slider. So let's forget about the old version now. Let's stick with the new. And I'm just going to start sculpting. We can push this a bit further. Alright, so I'm going to start with standard. Let's start with damn standard. I want to get all of these little details in the face that I haven't been able to get. There we go. I can really start to get very deep into the sculpt. And just become a little bit more detail oriented. I can push everything that's happening in here. Now I don't want to go too deep because I'm a little worried that Zbrush won't be able to get too deep in here, and we'll have to clean up a bit of it. I'll be inserting eyes or just some quick spheres into the eye cavities here, the eye sockets. Don't want to worry about having to maintain a perfect sphere, so we'll get to that a little later. And I got to figure this out now. Let's go to standard. I want something a little bit more aggressive. I'm going to increase our intensity. And I want to make sure that this reads as soft and that the jaw here reads as rigid. I'm just going to add that skin. Maybe just slowly blends off. And just like when working with the Z-spheres and the Z-remeshed model, I'm going to hold off on increasing my resolution until I have what I need. I'm going to try to pace myself here. Notice that it has a nice curvature to it. I'm just going to start carving into it. I'm going to get my tertiary shapes to read. That's nice. Alright. And still love soft concrete. And I can erase that. Smooth that out. There's something very liberating about working with Dynamesh, especially after laying in all of your forms. It's like now you've earned it. Everything is nice and organized. I can play around with adding interesting details and ripples in the skin here. Really break up the anatomy in the arm. I can just be aggressive. Using Dam Standard, just really carving into these abdominal shapes. I'll smooth that out quite a bit when I get that all resolved. Okay, that breaks up nicely. I still feel like the eyes could be a bit closer together. Even at this stage, I can still get away with moving shapes more evenly than if I had more resolution. Let's go in here, and let's really tuck that in. There we go. That's interesting. Pull that back a little bit. Let's go in here. So this will be the gullet. It'll be crushing eggs and sucking them down here. So you can see we've really pushed that as far as it's going to go. Let the mesh repair itself just by hitting Control and clicking to the side. There you go. So still, even at this density, I'm not going to increase it until I'm happy with what I have. keep me from, again, getting too detail-oriented and too focused on one area. Granted, I am spending quite a bit of time on the face, but as I mentioned before, that is the payoff. Also, let's look down here. If you remember, there was quite a bit of collision before in the model. In the previous section, actually I can pull that right up. You can see that I just pulled the model into itself here. Now in Dynamesh, it's repaired itself completely. So I love going between ZRemesher and Dynamesh. Smooth that out. I don't want him to look so perfect. I'm going to add all of these weird pits to the anatomy. Don't want to overdo it too much, but interesting wrinkle patterns. Always consider why a form is wrinkling. All wrinkles occur from use. We're going to get a lot of use around here, around the arm, rotating the arm. I mean, we are born with a few wrinkles around our knuckles, mainly, our knees, our elbows. A little bit of extra skin there to allow for movement. Now, I'm trying to think as I'm working, there are things that scavengers can do to protect themselves. And I'm thinking that this creature, he eats eggs. I mean, that could be his primary diet, or his, if he's lucky enough to catch an egg, is his primary diet. But he could just be an all-over scavenger, and he could just eat carrion or dead animals when he can't get to a delicious egg. And some animals, like the Zilla monster, I think that's what it's called, have such toxic saliva that they can actually be very, very dangerous. And so maybe this wrinkles up quite a bit, but a defense mechanism that the creature might have is he might be able to fill this sac with spit and digestive material and just load this up so it'll inflate almost like a frog, and then spit it at his natural predators, whatever would attack him. Maybe just blinds them, gives him enough time to run away. Maybe it's corrosive, but not enough to kill. So at this point in the tutorial, I decided to speed up the footage. I spent about 2 to 3 hours working on the subtlety of the sculpt, trying to figure out the anatomy and the details. I'm still utilizing the same tools, the move brush, standard, dam standard, clay, even clay tubes, and quite a bit of soft concrete. I'll also be using some of the alphas, and I'll be adding a lot of skin texture to the model. And this is a bit of an exploratory stage for me. The majority of the design is resolved. As a matter of fact, the design was resolved as soon as I did that sketch. This is the stage where I just resolve the details and figure out how the anatomy works with this bizarre body. You'll notice that I will be jumping from detailing out areas to moving big pieces. At this stage, I think I just kind of got into a zone, and I didn't want to worry about recording my voice. as I was working, it was slowing me down a bit. And at this stage, it can be a bit meditative. You can really just explore the anatomy. There are things that are set up in the design that you have to justify. If the arm is twisting in a weird way, you have to support that with anatomy and detail. And that's really what I'm doing here. I'm defining the planes, I'm working with the muscle groups that I've already established, and I'm justifying them with detail. And you can see even at this stage, there's a lot of back face mask. I'm still merging the model into itself in order to get those forms to be a little bit more clean. Working that way, they tend to average themselves out, and it's a really nice way to work. Still pushing the anatomy, the lats, the serratus muscles. Even though the creature is bizarre, all that anatomy is still in play. So as I'm adding little details, I'm actually just trying those details out and deciding whether or not I want to commit to them. Now, during this process, because I've been doing creatures for so long, I find that if I'm actually a little bit distracted while I'm doing this, I make better choices. And oftentimes at this stage, I'll be listening to music that gets me in the mood. And it helps me just to get into a zone where I'm not overthinking everything. And as artists, when you have just a large amount of knowledge to design an anatomy, it's not hard to overthink things, and that can really slow you down. So I'm still refining the anatomy, using polygroups to get to those hard to reach areas, defining the brachialis, wrinkles in the elbow, just continuing to jump around. Isolating sections really helps to focus. Soft concrete is my favorite brush for sculpting subtle anatomy. It has a wonderful quality to it that makes it feel like it's just under the skin, those details. Notice as I watch this video, it does feel like I'm sketching. And that is what I'm doing, essentially. I'm just taking these simple brushes and I'm trying stuff out, seeing if they make sense. Anatomy has a flow to it. And in order to have a convincing creature design, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that flow of anatomy on this bizarre skeleton. Focusing on these back plates now, I'm coming to the conclusion that I want some plates back there. I imagine that for the character, it's another place where the creature can emote, can express himself. Perhaps the plates raise slightly when he's threatened or trying to be threatening. Spending a lot of time going through and just establishing the subtle details in the anatomy. I'm also using back face mask quite a bit. Always have to consider the functionality. And every time you're adding these wrinkles, that's what you're indicating. No matter what you're doing at this stage, unless you're turning in an animated character to a client, which we're probably just a few years away from doing in the design phase, every wrinkle indicates how the creature moves, whether it's on a knee, indicating that that knee moves, or whether it's around the eyes, indicating that the eyes are capable of emoting. Pay attention to the brushes that I use. Oftentimes, it's used not just to get the job done, but also sometimes I'm just getting sick of using a brush, and switching from, let's say, soft concrete to clay kind of frees me from a mental block, just like drawing with a pencil all day and then switching to a ballpoint pen. Sometimes using a different tool will help change the way you work. So here I'm just creating that pattern for those plates to come down. It's obviously a vertebrae-like plate system, and this will protect him from predators that are larger than he is. Really want to push the tendons in the arm. Keep thinking about that thin reference that I have on my collage. That's very tempting when starting in creature design to do very cliche things, and one of the most cliche things is to do a skeletal creature, a creature made of bones, or a creature made of spikes, or a bodybuilder creature, and none of those really occur in nature. And so after teaching for almost 7 years now, I see that that's the three categories that students fall into when starting creature design. So even though this creature is very thin, it's very important that in order to show its ability to function, that we cover it in muscle and skin. Because if a creature is made out of bone, which, it's been done, it begs the question, like, without muscles and tendons, how does this thing move? Of course, with some projects, there's a certain level of disbelief that gets thrown out. But as a creature designer, your first priority should be to design creatures that look as if they could exist, and that comes from a really good understanding of basic anatomy. You have to know it so well that you can manipulate it and bend it around different forms, like this character. And the trick is just to figure out what is the simple mechanics of what you're resolving. Right now I'm focusing on this area, and this is just a wrist. We've moved the thumbs up, but now we have to justify that with anatomy. We've got a lot of little bones in the wrist that come together. It also looks a bit like a knee as well. So I'm just taking those familiar shapes and my understanding of the basic anatomical system, and I'm tweaking it. I'm adding tendons, things that are recognizable in a bizarre form. Just finding those things that people can latch onto and identify so that they can believe it. Here we have the palm. Here, just 2 fingers. I'm going to help him navigate across the rocks. Even going into details, let's divide those fingers up a bit. I have a feeling at this stage one of these hands is going to be up. And when it comes to posing your creature, the first thing you want to do is break symmetry, not only in the overall body, but you want to make sure that the hands and feet are doing something slightly different in order to make it exciting. People tend to get bored around patterns and repetition. Hopefully they won't get too bored with these repetitious plates on the tail here. So pay attention to the brushes that I'm using. I'm able to do all of this just with standard. Pulling out the pec, and we've neglected the face for a little bit, so I'm going to tweak that. Now, as I mentioned before, what's wonderful about working on a sculpt is that you can jump around and give your brain a chance to almost subconsciously come up with better solutions for areas that you're not currently working on. So oftentimes I'll hold back on the face, I'll do a little bit, step away from it, resolve an arm, and do a little bit more. As long as the model is being resolved, and you're constantly moving forward. You're never wasting time. There we go. Trying to figure out the mechanics of that jaw. Even though that design is pretty resolved in that sketch, when you really zoom in on the creature, there's a lot that needs to be explained. That's why even if you're looking at this tutorial as a modeler and not necessarily a designer, you still have to interpret someone's sketches, and being able to connect the dots that are not indicated in a concept will make you a better modeler. Really depends on what studio you're working for, what project you're working on, but sometimes sketches that are very loose get approved for final characters in films, and it's the job of either the sculptor in the practical effects house or the modeler in the visual effects house to connect those dots. And it's amazing to see what you can get just by using these simple brushes. Move, standard. I always ask myself as I'm working, like, am I believing this? Or does that feel like a stylized choice? Anytime a piece does feel stylized, always revert back to the reference. As long as these plates are sliding one on top of the other, they can function. If they just end and meet each other, then the entire back locks up. So you almost have to think of it as a Spanish tile on a roof. There we go. Yeah, these ribs feel a bit stylized. I'm going to bring this back in using the clay brush. Little peaks don't make sense to me. Again, I'm making a lot of use out of the alphas, and we'll be getting into that a bit more in the next section. We're really going to detail this character out. This is all just prep, really, for the final ZRemesh and for detail work. And so I want to make sure that even the tertiary details, like the little teeth on the mandibles, are resolved, because ZRemesher will be able to factor in all of those forms when it remeshes the model. It'll actually put loops around each individual tooth. It's very hard to remember that at times when working in Dynamesh. Sometimes you have to just remind yourself, don't finish the sculpt in Dynamesh. Finish it on the ZRemeshed model. It'll be a lot easier because the geometry will be flowing in the direction of your detail. It's just a very intuitive feature. Here I'm resolving the eyes, and you notice that I've isolated the head. This is where I want to spend some time making sure that that character reads. He's really starting to feel like a vulture to me right now. Those four mandibles, the upper and the lower, I mean, that might as well just be a beak in silhouette. And that's the desired effect. Those thighs are really bizarre. And I'm not 100% sure how they function. I just, at this point, think they look functional, so we're in a good place. There we go. A lot of wrinkles around the eyes. Now he's going to be able to express himself by moving his mandibles, and chances are he might be able to actually make clicking noise by banging them together. Maybe that's how they communicate with each other, almost by doing some kind of clicking Morse code. It sounds like two rocks smacking together. It would be cool. Be a very eerie noise. And these are the things that I think about while I'm sculpting. You never know when you're in a meeting and a client asks you why, why or how do they emote, how do they potentially communicate with each other, and while you're in there, the last thing you want to say is, oh, I have no idea. In the process of doing the sculpt, I usually get to a point with the character or the creature where I can answer all of those questions because I've spent so much time working on the design and imagining the character move and function in the film. As I've mentioned before, things that help me to visualize the character, aside from just resolving it in 3D, is listening to music and creating a potential soundtrack for the film, or at the very least for the scene in which the creature is in. I really want to push that emaciated anatomy. I want to get those tendons in there and make sure that the fingers are doing everything that they need. At this point I decided to have these rolling upper pectoral muscles. Yeah, I like the idea of having little teeth up there. Probably try it again soon. Little details, little accents. I'm also thinking about how I'm going to render this creature in 3D. I imagine that he's going to be really slimy. I just want him to be slimy. And all these little details are going to catch nice highlights when we do our keyshot turntable. Yeah. It's really starting to come together. It's really starting to feel like the character. So I've neglected these back legs. I'm going to spend some time here carving out some details. Make sure that the wrinkles make sense. With the creature's tail back there like that, it's virtually impossible that his knees would meet. Now here's a great quick choice, adding extra fingers to these back legs.